Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Hi everybody, welcome back. Another week, another podcast. I'm really excited for this one to roll around because I've got a little change in approach this time around. Over the last few weeks, a few things have happened to me that alerted me to something that I actually think is really, really important. And that is the issue of men sharing their story. One of the things that we're socialized into is to usually try and keep things to ourselves. And one of the things that happened was, firstly, a friend of mine who's a business coach approached me and wanted to interview me for a segment with men. And I thought that was a fantastic idea. I really loved the notion of being involved even further, aside from the work that I'm doing with Making Good Men Great, to be able to speak about men's issues, about what we are about what are our challenges, what are the things that hold us back, and where we actually could go, where we could head towards in our own growth. Because I think it's really, really important. It's really necessary. I could spend, a good hour or 2 hours talking about our statistics, but in this context, I don't think that's necessarily all that useful. So he sent me some questions, and I thought I'd share those with you, and my response to some of that, because, you're hopefully listening to my podcasts, and I became aware that to date, I actually haven't shared necessarily a great deal about myself. Yes, I'm a psychologist, I'm a speaker, I'm an author, but what about me as a person? And so I thought I'd give you a little window through which you may shape a particular perspective about me. So let me go through this. So Jerome asked me what were my biggest challenges as a man so far in life, and how did I overcome them? Now, for whatever reason, I consider myself to have really had a blessed and charmed life in many respects. And yes, I could be even more aspirational, and I'll probably, could maybe want more, but I don't. I'm very content in myself, in my career. So, when it came down to what were the biggest challenges, well, there's the usual surviving my teenage years. I think most boys survive by sheer luck, not necessarily by any, great brain power or foresight. So that was one. I mean, I had a close call with a motorbike accident that made me never touch a motorbike again in my whole life. It wasn't bad, but it freaked the hell out of me. And I realized that, you don't mess around with machinery until you know what you're doing. And I very clearly had no clue about what I was doing. The other issue was, my schooling. I sort of didn't really exactly know what I wanted to do when I was in high school. I loved surfing, I loved music, I loved girls, and I loved my friends. And to me, that was what school was about. The whole academic thing was a sideline. And to be honest, I didn't perform very well at school because I didn't really have a sense of vision beyond school. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. The one thing that I wanted to do was marine biology because I was into the ocean. But the careers advisor at the time suggested to me that, there's no jobs in that and you'd probably be better off looking at something else. Well, I didn't have a something else. There's nothing else to go back to. And, hearing from most of the adults around me that, most musicians are poor and starving, that wasn't necessarily all that attractive either. Surfing in when I grew up was not a professional sport. It was just the beginning, it was the beginnings of the bronzed Aussies and that. And again, if you spoke to most of the adults at the time with sons who were into surfing and girls who were trying to get into surfing, it was like, there was a bit of a negative perception about that. And certainly it wasn't something to do that you could base a living on. Now, obviously, people like Tom Carroll proved them wrong. So, it was one of those things. I did have an awakening, however, when I went to a psychology lecture with a friend of mine, and I'd been working in a bank, and I wasn't very satisfied with what I was doing. And I took the day off work. It was a naughty thing to do, but I took the day off work, and he and I went to his lecture, and after that we were going to go surfing. He fell asleep, and I was fascinated. And it was an introductory psychology lecture. So I went, wow, this is something that I could really see myself doing, is to study human behavior. I was interested in people. I was interested in philosophy. So there was a lot of stuff going on in just that 2-hour block that got me thinking and actually begin to try and formulate a path forward into what's become an extraordinarily satisfying and fulfilling career. So that was the upside of things, and uni it wasn't necessarily easy, but I loved it. I was passionate about it, and from there on, my career sort of took off, as did my personal life. And the big challenge that I ran into ultimately that had a massive impact on me was the loss of my parents. And my first parent to pass away was my dad. And I hadn't actually at the time contemplated losing him, although I was concerned for his health. So at the same time, in a 10-day period, I also lost my father-in-law, with whom I was very close. He and I shared an interesting relationship. Very different political views, but we had a passion for life and the good things in life that so we understood each other on that. Music, food, wine, that type of thing. And he was a very important part of my life, as was my dad. But with my dad, we weren't necessarily, close in the conventional sense. We loved each other, but he was a person who, through his own upbringing, had some real struggles in forming, intimate, close relationships. And for whatever reason, I was always able, in a sense, to be forgiving of what other people would see in him as shortcomings, including my mother. And then a couple of decades later, I lost my mum. And, in many respects, I attribute a lot of who I am to her in a way, especially in the way that I relate to other people, and especially women. She taught me really to respect women. She was a very strong, determined woman who was very family oriented, shared, many, many stories of her own upbringing in Transylvania and during the Second World War in Vienna, and the sort of hardships that she encountered in her life in those days. So, losing both of them, and given that I'm an only child, I suddenly found myself feeling like an orphan. Even at my age, in my 50s, it was like, wow, that's not something I'd necessarily anticipated. So yeah, that was a big deal. And when people say, oh, the pain dies away. Well, no, we learn to live with the grief. It never goes away, but it becomes less of a forefront experience. It subsides, then it comes back. I mean, this last Mother's Day, I had a dream of my mother where she was sitting at a table and my granddaughter was playing around her, and she looked up and she looked at me and smiled and she says, "Where have you been? I've been waiting for you," which is something that she often said to me when I visited her. So that's where I go. That was probably, the loss was probably the biggest challenge that I'd faced really in What's a Blessed Life. Um, Now, I've been also very, very fortunate that I met essentially my soulmate. And in many respects, my challenge was to make that work as well as I could, given that, as an only child, you got some challenges about things like sharing and, being accountable. I had to really learn very early on in the piece that if I wanted to keep my partner, who I love dearly with all my heart, I needed to really step it up. So, in reflection from that question, one of the things I want to say is that one of the things that really feeds me is that sense of gratitude that I have for, what I have in my life. It's not luck, but in some ways there is an element of luck in it. But I also need to own the fact that I really worked at it. So the second question that Jerome asked me was more broad. And he said, what do you think are a man's biggest challenge today? Okay, and we took out the idea of the COVID-19. And my response to that was, well, where do I start? And the thing that I really focus a lot on with men is about the fact that we need to completely rethink our ideas of success, our definition of being a man, and also really rethink about how to be in relationships with ourselves and others, and also the legacy that I'm going to leave, because we do leave legacies, whether we like it or not, and we have a choice in the type of legacy that we leave behind. And again, I've mentioned in other podcasts that we've become extremely egocentric. And I think we need to be much, much more community oriented. I was listening to a YouTube where a reporter was talking about the fact that, if we're going to insist on our rights, then we also need to respect the responsibilities that those rights have and bring with them. And I can't agree more with that. We really need to get that into context, and we're not. We've become very I-centric, and the sort of inherent selfishness and narcissism that is being propagated from the top down is, for each of us as an individual man, a real point of reflection. And I was watching a documentary the other day, and the documentary was called "Assholes: A Theory." And I think a lot of us need to sort of take stock and go, do I want to be an asshole or not? And for most of us, ultimately, the answer is, well, no, I don't. And so that's an important issue. So the other thing amongst all of that is that I really think that as men, we need to get clear about what our values are and what it means both for ourselves and for the people in our lives. And so, it's just one of those things that's going to make such a difference if I exercise kindness, compassion, tolerance. If I look to work with people, to cooperate, rather than compete with them and try to make them lose. And as I said, again, it comes back to that documentary that I watched, and there's a book called Assholes: A Theory, and I highly recommend everyone reading that because it relates a great deal to this notion of patriarchy as well. I mean, patriarchs very frequently are just assholes and vice versa. So I think that is essentially man's biggest challenge today. So again, I want to sort of call upon everybody to think about that, to reflect on it. And, don't be an asshole, be a mensch. The other part of it is to get emotionally disciplined. And sometimes one of the things I talk about is, look, forget about the emotional discipline if you just get disciplined, because you'll feel better. Now, I do emphasize emotional discipline because it's about how we regulate our feelings in respect to being able to adapt to what the environment throws at us. What does our, context mean to me? How do I deal with it? What do I make of it? And the other part that I talked about is that we really need to stop searching for perfection especially happiness. My experience, the search for happiness, in fact, usually leads us to being unhappy. And in some instances, it can actually destroy you. And I think potentially there's even a book in that. So Jerome then asked me really about if I've got any tips, like, have you got some tips that you could give us men to perform better in life, and what has your, experience and expertise taught you? So again, if I have to narrow it down to 3 tips, the first one is to learn how to be intimate and authentic, especially in our loving relationships. That includes my wife, my partner, my children, maybe family, friends. Intimacy rests on meaningful conversations. It really is. There's a really important aspect in that disclosure, in that, unloading our soul to one another, not to get sympathy or to sound like a victim, but simply to share. One of the things that I often see with teenage boys is they know very little about their dad, either practically, like, for example, what do they do for work, or where dad's at emotionally. A lot of dads don't ever share anything with their sons about how they deal with their challenges in life, with their experiences of love, about, work, about their passions, about the things that they hate. It's not always going to be positive. In fact, a lot of times I think it's really important to share with our sons and daughters when, basically shit goes pear-shaped. And what do we need to do? So it's really important. And the second tip then is to be honest and transparent. Don't sugar dust it. Don't coat it up. Don't spin it. There's a real danger in this overly optimistic, positive approach to life. That's unreal. It's in fact, as much as the search for happiness is dangerous, so is this persistent idea of positivity. And the third tip is, and this was a big lesson for me, is to be accountable for myself and my actions. In other words, I need to have a moral backbone. If I screw up, I've screwed up. It's not necessarily going to be the end of the world. It might feel that way, but ultimately it's about putting things right. So if I've made a mistake, if I've, unintentionally or intentionally harmed someone, firstly, I need to apologize, and secondly, I need to make amends and not blame. And so I think that's the stuff that, comes out of my experience. And it holds true for me as a husband. It holds true for me as a partner in business. It holds true for me as a dad, as a granddad. And the value of living comes through the texture of all those experiences. And so when people say to me, there is nothing to live for, is you're not looking in the right place. Look inside yourself and towards the relationships that you have. Money and material professional success is lovely, but it's not ultimately necessarily going to float your boat. So just some personal thoughts. I hope if you've got any questions that you'll get in touch. If you want to be part of the show, love to hear from you. And until next week, this is me signing off.
Thank you, Gunter, and thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Again, if you have any questions or comments or ideas for a show, you can email development@noirtainment.com. That's development@noirtainment.com. Thank you, and thank you for listening.
Love can take us higher. Love can take us so high.